welcome. In today's episode, I'm going to share Goatman stories I found on the internet. These stories include a woman who sees a bizarre creature on a back road in North Carolina and a boy and his uncle who had an encounter in an abandoned community after hunting. But first, we start with a story from a man who shares an encounter he had while camping as a child. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who saw a terrifying creature while camping with his family. The original poster, or OP, looked up Goatman before posting his encounter online, and it really freaked him out, because he's pretty sure that's exactly what he saw that day. When going camping, he and his family stayed in a camper. The OP and his sister would sleep in a compartment directly above the cab, where the driver's seat was located. One day during the trip, he woke up at around 6 or 7 in the morning to a disturbing sight when something caught his eye out the small porthole-shaped window. When he saw the creature, he says he couldn't make out the torso very well, but the head, arms, and legs were all visible. Initially, he thought it was a deer standing on its hind legs. He distinctly remembers this thing's head being enormous and tells people it looked like a deer's head. However, after learning about Goatman, he thinks it could have been a large goat head. Regardless, its limbs were exceptionally long and thin, and it was tall enough for its head to be at eye level with him in the RV's loft. He recalls the creature's arms being extended out to the sides, bent at the elbows, with its wrists hanging limply and hands moving in a way he describes as slowly flapping, both twitching in a disjointed manner, as if it were agitated. Oddly enough, it's the hands that linger in his memory more than anything else and filled him with fear during the encounter. Maybe, he says, it was because at that moment when he noticed this thing's hands, he truly realized he was looking at something that was not a deer. The creature just stood there staring at the RV for a long moment before pulling its arms back against its chest, lowering its head and limping away with its back hunched over. When he told his family, no one believed him and chalked it up to him having a nightmare. However, his recent discovery of Goatman has left him wanting to do some more research on that particular cryptid. The absolute last thing I would want to roll over and see after waking up would be a creature like this. And to be out in the middle of the wilderness on top of that, in this thing's domain, no thank you. Hearing encounters like this one makes me glad I've never been interested in camping. I know the OP thinks he saw a Goatman early that morning, and that's why I included it in a Goatman episode, but based on his description of the creature, especially the way he describes the head as well as the limbs, I'm leaning more toward this thing being a Wuchuge rather than a Goatman. However, he was young at the time, so it's possible that he mistook the goat head for a deer head, but the creature he saw, based on how he describes it, more aligns with a Wuchuge. For those who may not know, a Wuchuge looks like what many people think a Wendigo looks like. Their heads are usually described as looking like a deer or a deer skull, and they have antlers. Wendigo do not look like this. Wuchuge are also described as being very tall and having elongated, thin limbs like the creature in this story. They are said to have fur and hooved feet as well. Now, the OP doesn't describe the body or whether this thing had fur or not, but if he thinks it was a Goatman, I'm guessing it did. I will say though that the OP did some research on a Goatman and immediately thought that's what he saw, so maybe his younger self was mistaken about this creature's head and what it looked like. In any case, I'm just glad this thing decided to just walk away rather than approach the RV or worse. What do you think about this one? And what do you think he saw that morning? A Goatman, a Wuchuge, or something else entirely? The next story comes to us from North Carolina, where one poster shares what his grandmother saw one night while driving down some back roads. This story takes place back in the 1980s and is a great example of cryptid sightings and encounters not being just a recent phenomenon. As I mentioned before, the grandmother, who also had a friend with her, was out in the country and on a road surrounded by trees, with hardly any houses in sight. As they rounded a curve, they crossed over some railroad tracks in an area that was almost pitch black. The only light came from the moon and the truck's headlights. As they slowed to cross the tracks, her headlights illuminated something bizarre. The grandmother and her friend caught sight of a creature that appeared to be a mix of a man and a goat, standing on the roadside in the forest. This being had a human-like head with horns. It stood upright on its hind legs and had hooves instead of feet. According to her estimation, the creature stood at 7 to 8 feet tall based on where it came up to on the trees. It had the upper body of a man, but she depicts this thing as so malevolent in appearance that it barely resembled a human. The grandmother urged her friend to quickly shut and lock the cab's sliding window out of fear that the creature might leap into the truck's bed. About a month goes by and the grandmother is once again traveling down a backcountry road, but this time she had her husband with her. The grandmother was dozing off in the passenger seat, but her husband suddenly woke her up to share that he had spotted a man-goat creature by the roadside, describing it in full detail. He described the same exact creature she had previously seen. However, this encounter took place approximately 50 miles from her initial sighting, and she had never mentioned the first incident to him. This, the OP says, proves that he was being genuine and not just playing a prank on her. There's no telling what you might see while driving down a back road at night, and I've heard enough stories to know it could quite honestly be anything. Unfortunately, this woman and her friends saw the more terrifying side of it, and her husband saw something very similar, if not the exact same thing, later on. These creatures go out of their way to not be seen most of the time. I say most of the time because there are encounters where they seem to go out of their way to be seen. But usually, for whatever reason, they normally try to remain hidden and go unnoticed. A very dark backcountry road would be the perfect spot to move around in, that is, unless of course a car comes driving by, which is exactly what happened to this creature not just once, but possibly twice. I only say possibly because we aren't sure that they saw the same creature. In a way, it's a good thing her husband saw this thing too. Usually when an encounter happens, people don't talk about it for fear of being called crazy or worse. They don't want people looking at them funny or even ridiculing them. At least after her husband saw this creature, they could share it with each other and have someone to talk to. Also, they probably felt a little less crazy knowing that they had both seen the same thing. Now they can share their story with each other, and it makes a great story for their grandchildren as well. As for what each of them saw, they both described the same creature, and from what they described, it sounds like a Goatman to me. What do you think they saw on those backcountry roads in North Carolina? And do you think they saw the same creature, or did they see two different Goatmen? The final story of this episode comes to us from Minnesota, where one poster and his uncle had a terrifying experience while driving home from hunting one night. It was the final day of rifle season in northern Minnesota. The OP and his uncle had no luck and were on their way back home. His uncle suggested taking the back roads to an old Finnish farming community where the OP's grandmother grew up. The OP says here that he isn't sure why his uncle decided to go by there, being that it was pitch black out. As they drove toward the community, they came across a car with its flashers on, and due to his uncle being what he calls, quote, Minnesota nice, he stopped to help. However, he quickly discovered that the car was empty with the driver's side door wide open. He circled the vehicle, calling out to anyone nearby, but he was met with nothing but silence. A strange, quote, red liquid stained the pavement, though his uncle dismissed it at the moment, speculating that perhaps the man had shot a deer and was dealing with it somewhere in the woods. They left the scene behind and continued on to the small community, which offered little more than a handful of weathered houses lining the road. But as they drove past one particularly messy house, his uncle suddenly slammed on the brakes. He thought he had hit a deer and jumped out with his flashlight and gun in hand. The OP followed, armed only with his flashlight, and they began their search. They started by scanning the area in front of the truck, then turned their attention to the ditch. However, just as they approached the ditch, they heard what sounded like something big running. They shined their lights in the direction and spotted what looked like someone with pointy objects on their head ducking behind a tree. When they shined their lights on the tree, a piercing scream echoed through the night. Without a second thought, he and his uncle sprinted back to the truck and sped away. As the OP glanced back, the glow of the taillights revealed a silhouette as they sped away going 70 in a 45. His uncle paid little mind to how fast he was driving, seemingly unfazed by the risk of getting caught by the law. They both kept silent about what they witnessed that night. The OP suspects it was a Goatman, but he says he can't be certain. The scream, he says, was bone-chilling and reminiscent of someone in agonizing pain. I know we don't get a very detailed description of the creature, but from what the original poster saw, he believes he encountered a Goatman. He said he and his uncle saw what looked like pointy objects protruding from the creature's head, and I'm guessing if it was a Goatman, when he saw the silhouette, it would have been pretty easy for him to tell. As for the abandoned car, I'm not sure how I would react in that certain situation, so it's hard for me to understand how anyone else would either. That being said, I can't really blame them for leaving. But if I had seen that creature not that far away, I believe I would have called the police to report it. There's no telling what really happened there, but based on how he describes the scene, I don't think it was anything good. Moving on, an abandoned community would be the perfect place for something like this to make its dwelling. There wouldn't be anyone coming around to bother it. Well, except maybe someone taking a trip down memory lane in the middle of the night. I'm willing to bet neither of them have been back to that community day or night, and neither want to go back at all. Not after what they experienced that night. As for what this creature was, I can't really give a guess due to there being no physical description except for it maybe having horns, but I do think, just as I mentioned before, that the silhouette of a Goatman would be unmistakable. Minnesota is known for having a lot of cryptid encounters, so if it wasn't a Goatman, it was definitely something that didn't want him or his uncle poking around that abandoned home. What do you think they saw that night? A Goatman or something else? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.